How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylei Hobby Time. A couple weeks ago, I bought these two pirate ships from Lindbergh's Jolly Rancher series, and today I'm going to create a realistic battle on the high seas between the two of them. I started with the Green Apple, also known as the Flying Dutchman, and I saw on the box that this set is supposed to glow in the dark, so I decided to test it out and see the spooky glow for myself. Sure enough, after the lights had gone out, the ship began to glow, a nice, pleasant, but ghostly Flying Dutchman green. It's a shame because I'm going to be covering all of this up with paint later on. I removed the kit from the box and began the assembly. Step 3 on the instructions was cannon times 30. "30 cannons may seem like a lot, but it's only a third of the total cannons in this project. After cutting out and gluing the 30 guns to their 30 bases, I glued them and a few other details in place on the gun deck, including a boo box filled with scorpions. I threw the main deck over the gun deck and went a little further into the construction before I realized that there were a lot of white surfaces that would be unreachable later on after the sides of the ship were in place. So I took the interior of the ship outside and I sprayed it black before adding the sides of the ship and sealing up the gun deck forever. Next, I added the figurehead, some ladders, tender, rails, 30 covers onto the 30 gun ports, and the rest of the little bits before putting on the bowsprit and the masts. This ship had 3 masts, including the 4-mast, the 5-mast, and the 6-mast. The sails on this kit were super flimsy and finicky, and the instructions called for them to be sewed in place, to which I responded, no thanks, I'd rather get super glue in my eyes. Instead, I glued all of the sails in place, as I did with just a little bit of the rigging. I enjoy putting model kits together, but for me, when the string starts, that's where the fun stops. After throwing on the rope ladders, the assembly of the first ship was done, and it was time to move on to the assembly of the second ship, the one that came in the Chili Mango Jolly Rancher box. Was the Satisfaction of Captain Henry Morgan. This ship, which we will call Sokum for short, was way better in my opinion because it came with a figurehead that's a little child on a pigeon. This ship also had twice as many cannons as the first ship, but half of them weren't real cannons. In reality, they were just gun barrels with little flanges to imply the presence of a cannon, which is pretty sneaky. After cutting out all the pseudo-cannons, I glued them to the interior of the ship's hull. While I did enjoy the assembly of these ships quite a bit, they took a lot of time. I completed just the assembly, painting, and everything else excluded, in the same amount of time that it would usually take me to complete a full 1-week build, about 12 hours. That's why I turned this project into a 2-week build. After cutting out the rest of the real cannons, I assembled them, put them in place on the deck, and I finished the rest of the assembly on the second ship. After both of the ships had been assembled, I took them outside and I primed them to get ready for the painting. I then slapped on a vinyl glove and I broke out my airbrush. I decided to go with colors that would be a little less distracting than the colorful painting options seen on the boxes. Please don't be offended if these pirate ships are not historically accurate. I painted the Satisfaction to be plain wood with white sails and red flags. I used the airbrush for the majority of the paint job, so I could cover more surface area more quickly. Also used a piece of the instruction manual as a makeshift mask for the Jacob's ladders. I painted the Flying Dutchman black with dark red sails, and I finished off all the details on both ships with a paintbrush. Next, it was time to make the base. I routed a space in this picture frame to hold the switch. I cut a piece of MDF to fit as the hardcover within the frame, with a little spot for the battery housing. I used a combination of super glue and framing points to make sure it was nice and sturdy. Next, I cut a piece of XPS foam down to the size of the interior of the frame, and I cut away a slot on each side to allow for the bottoms of the ships to sit slightly under the surface level of the foam. I traced out the general shape of the ships and used a combination of hobby knife, pliers, and my fingers to remove the unneeded material. After those were carved, I threw on a respirator, opened up a window, and I burned the surface of the foam with a butane torch to create some natural-looking wave patterns. I then wrapped the foam in a sheet of wrinkled tin foil, and I smoothed out all the sharp edges. After that, I covered the whole thing in Mod Podge to give the foil a layer of protection and also act as a primer for the paint layer. This foil water technique is one that I learned from Scale-A-Ton. He's got an incredible scale model and diorama channel. I will link it over here, as well as in the description. You should definitely go check it out. I masked off the frame, and then I applied a layer of white to the entire foil surface. After that, I mixed up a dark sea green. I covered almost the entirety of the surface with it, aside from the peaks of the waves. Then I mixed up some steel blue with a glaze medium to create a transparent blue. Went over the whole surface with that blue, concentrated in the deepest areas. Then I took the whole thing outside and I applied a gloss varnish. I finished off the water effects with some whitewater highlight paint from Woodland Scenics. It's easy to work with and you can remove it if you make any mistakes. I put the ships in place to know exactly where I needed to simulate the agitated water. I was going for a not quite raging, but definitely unhappy sea look, and I think it turned out alright. Next, it was time to get the cannons on the ships. When sending little pieces of anything flying through the air, it's always a good idea to have some safety glasses on. I cut a large enough hole on both ships using my cutoff wheel to allow for the electronics to be added with as little frustration as possible. I then marked and carved a corresponding hole for each ship into the foam, and I flipped the base over and I routed out a slot in the MDF. If you're wondering how I did not mess up my tinfoil when I flipped it over like that, I actually used another frame underneath to hold it off the table while I was working on it. Next, it was time to figure out the electronics. I ran a pair of wires from the switch to each of the holes under the ships. I cut and stripped each end, connected all the positives together, and all the negatives together. After the wires had been connected to the battery housing and to the switch, I ran them over to the holes underneath the ships and I stapled them in place to keep them secure. I decided the best option for lights on this build were these little flexible guys. I doubled them over so that the leads were on the same side, connected them to some wires, and then I ran those wires through holes that I carved in the deck. After all of those were in place, I wired them all together underneath the ship and I connected them to the battery. I repeated the same process for the other ship, and I also went back and added some battle damage, which I should have done on the Dutchman before I added the lights. There were some gaps between the ships and the water, so I used some polyfill, dunked in Mod Podge, stuffed that in there, which actually made some believable little splashes. The last thing to do was to add some cotton puffs of smoke around the cannon blasts and trim off the loose fibers. After that, I called it good. Last month, my patrons voted on A Pirate's Life for Me as the theme for our monthly art challenge. Here is what they submitted. Please take a moment to appreciate their work before moving on to my final shots. Also, a few of the projects have videos to accompany them. I will link those in the description. Special thanks to all of the patrons who participated and submitted their beautiful art last month. that is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.